Widow living in her car. Inherited a $3 farmhouse. What was hidden in the walls made her rich. Barbara Linde had been living in her car for 11 days when the letter arrived. Not a real arrival exactly. She had not had a proper address for those 11 days, which meant the letter had been sitting in a postal holding queue, addressed to her last known residence, a rented room in a shared house on Clement Street that she had vacated on the 1st of the month when she could no longer cover the rent, and the landlord had been patient for as long as a landlord with a mortgage of his own could reasonably be asked to be patient. The letter had been forwarded to the post office on Garrett Avenue with a hold notice, and Barbara had found out about it only because she had stopped at that post office to use the restroom and had, on an impulse she could not fully explain, asked the clerk whether there was anything held under her name. There was. She sat in the driver's seat of her 2009 Honda Civic, which smelled of the sleep it had been providing her, and the meals she had been making on the small camping stove she kept in a plastic box in the trunk, and opened the envelope carefully, because she had developed in 11 days of having very little a new relationship with the physical condition of things, and did not want to damage anything unnecessarily. The letter was from a solicitor's office in a town called Granger Mills, 4 hours northeast of where she was currently parked. It informed her that she was the named beneficiary in the will of a woman named Cecily Marsh, her mother's older sister, who had passed away 6 weeks ago at the age of 87. The estate consisted primarily of a rural property on Old Quarry Road outside Granger Mills. The property had been assessed for tax purposes at a value of $3, reflecting its current state of disrepair and the significant outstanding maintenance liability attached to it. There were no other assets of substance. Barbara was invited to contact the office at her earliest convenience to discuss whether she wished to accept or decline the inheritance. She read the letter twice. Then she looked through the windshield at the post office car park and thought about Cecily Marsh, whom she had met exactly 4 times in her life, and who had existed in her memory primarily as a tall woman with very straight posture, who smelled of lavender, and who had spoken to Barbara at her mother's funeral 12 years ago with a kindness so direct and unperformed that Barbara had thought about it occasionally in the years since, without ever quite understanding why it had stayed with her. She thought about the phrase, $3. She thought about the 11 days behind her, the parking lots, the camping stove, the particular kind of exhaustion that came not from physical effort, but from the sustained, low-level work of managing fear quietly enough that it did not tip into something unmanageable. She was 68 years old. 1 month before the 11 days had started, she had buried her husband of 40 years and discovered in the weeks following the funeral that the financial situation she had believed they shared was considerably more complicated and considerably worse than she had understood. Frank had managed their money for the entirety of their marriage. She had trusted him to manage it. The details of exactly how he had managed it were still being untangled by a financial advisor who called her every week with a tone of careful compassion that Barbara had come to dread because it always preceded another piece of bad news, delivered in language designed to soften something that did not soften. The house had gone to cover the primary debt. The car was hers because it was registered in her name only and predated a certain transaction the advisor had flagged. The shared account had been emptied in the final months of Frank's illness in ways that were still being traced and that Barbara had stopped asking about because the answers served no purpose she could currently use. She had not told her children how bad it was. Her son Marcus lived in another state with a young family and a mortgage that already stretched him. Her daughter Celia had offered twice for Barbara to come and stay, which Barbara had declined both times, because declining felt like the last form of dignity available to her, and she was holding on to it with both hands. She had told neither of them about the car. She read the letter one more time, then she folded it back into the envelope, put it on the passenger seat, and started the engine. She had nowhere more pressing to be. She had $63 in her account, half a tank of fuel, and a letter telling her she owned something. The something might be a collapsing building on a piece of land that no county assessor had valued above $3. That was entirely possible. That was, in fact, the most statistically likely explanation for a rural property attached to no other assets and described in legal correspondence with the particular brevity reserved for things nobody expects anyone to fight over. But she was a 68-year-old widow sleeping in a Honda Civic, and the letter was on the passenger seat, and northeast was as good a direction as any. She drove. She found the solicitor's office on the main street of Granger Mills at 2:30 in the afternoon, in a building that appeared to have been there since before the street was paved, and had no particular interest in advertising that fact. The solicitor was a woman named Dorothy Haynes, who was approximately Barbara's age, and who looked at her across the desk with the attentive directness of someone who understood that the person sitting across from her was carrying considerably more than the matter at hand. She did not comment on this. She simply explained the estate clearly and without embellishment, which Barbara appreciated more than she could have easily expressed. Cecily had owned the farmhouse on Old Quarry Road for 51 years. The building was approximately 900 square feet of stone construction, situated on 2 acres of rural residential land. The $3 assessment reflected the current condition of the building, which had been unoccupied for the 3 years prior to Cecily's death, when Cecily had moved to a care facility, and the cost of bringing it to any habitable standard was estimated to substantially exceed the assessed land value. The farmhouse had been built in 1887 by a family named Whitmore. Dorothy said she wanted to be straightforward. Most people who inherited properties in this condition declined, because accepting meant accepting the associated liability, the tax obligations, the legal responsibility for a structure that was in its current state technically unsafe. Declining was simple and carried no judgment. Barbara asked if she could see the property before deciding. Dorothy gave her a key and drew a map by hand on a piece of notepaper because the road was not reliably on GPS and the turn was easy to miss. Barbara found it without missing the turn. The farmhouse sat behind a line of old oak trees that had grown large enough over the decades to partially obscure it from the road, which meant the first proper view came as she walked up the overgrown path, and the building revealed itself gradually rather than all at once. Stone walls the color of old pewter, a roof that had survived better than Dorothy's description had led her to expect, missing tiles in several places, but present in its essential structure rather than collapsed. 2 ground floor windows, one with glass intact and one boarded from outside, with timber weathered to silver gray. A front door that was sound in its frame. She unlocked it and stepped inside. Cold, dim, the smell of stone and age and years of closed air that old buildings develop when they have been sealed from the ordinary movement of life for too long. The ground floor was 2 rooms, a main room and a kitchen. The kitchen contained a cast iron range cooker that was visibly old and visibly solid, the kind of construction that outlasted everything built around it. The stone flag floors were uneven in places and intact throughout. And then there were the walls. Not the condition of the walls, which needed significant attention. What was on them? Cecily had covered every wall of the main room in paper. Not wallpaper. Documents, letters, photographs, maps, pages from notebooks, and pages that appeared to be official records of various kinds, attached to the plaster surface in overlapping layers that in some places were 3 or 4 sheets deep, assembled from knee height to the ceiling, across every available surface, in a density that stopped Barbara in the center of the room and made her turn slowly and simply look. She did not touch anything. She just looked. Whatever this was, it had taken years to put together. The arrangement was not random. She could feel the organization in it, even before she understood it. The way you feel the structure of a piece of music before you can name the key it is written in. She stayed for 2 hours. She walked every room, tested every floor, examined the roof space through a ceiling hatch above the upper sleeping area. The structure was worse in specific places and better in others than she had anticipated. The bones of the building were the bones of something constructed to outlast its builders, which it had. Before she left, she stood in front of the largest section of wall-mounted documents and looked more carefully. The photographs were old, many of them, black and white images of people and places she did not recognize, mounted beside handwritten letters in English and at least one other script she could not immediately identify. Maps showing land parcels and property boundaries, what appeared to be legal documents or copies of them, newspaper clippings yellowed to fragility, pages from what might have been a ledger, columns of figures in faded ink. Cecily had built an archive. In the walls of a farmhouse, assessed at $3, a woman who smelled of lavender had spent an unknown number of years assembling something that Barbara did not yet understand, but could feel the weight of, the way you feel the weight of a sentence before you have finished reading it. She locked the farmhouse, drove back to Granger Mills, and knocked on Dorothy's door 20 minutes before closing. She said she was accepting the inheritance. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and began preparing the paperwork. Barbara signed her name and drove back to Old Quarry Road as the November dark gathered, and parked outside the oak trees and slept in the Honda Civic for the last time on land that was now legally and entirely hers. In the morning, she brought the camping stove inside and made coffee in the kitchen next to the old cast iron range, and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at the walls in the morning light, which was considerably better than the afternoon light had been, coming through the intact window at a low, flat angle that caught the layered documents with a clarity that the previous day's dimness had not offered. She set the coffee on the stone floor and began to read. It took her 4 days to understand what she was looking at. She worked methodically, left to right across the largest wall, reading every document she could decipher, and photographing everything on her phone, and writing notes in the spiral notebook she had carried in her bag since the first week in the car. She set aside documents in languages she could not read. She focused first on the English language material and the maps, and let the pattern they were forming develop at its own pace, rather than forcing a conclusion before the evidence supported one. The Whitmore family had built the farmhouse in 1887. The documents on the walls were a family archive that Cecily had assembled over decades, tracing the Whitmore land holdings from their original registration in the late 19th century through a series of transactions, divisions, and legal complications that had scattered ownership across multiple parties over the generations that followed. The archive was not nostalgic. It was not the kind of collection a person assembled out of sentiment or historical interest. It was the kind of collection a person assembled because they were building a case. On the third day, Barbara found the document that Cecily had placed at approximately eye height on the central wall, in a position that she understood, once she had found it, was entirely deliberate. It was a deed of covenant dated 1923, signed by the then head of the Whitmore family, written in the dense legal language of that era, which required Barbara 2 full, careful readings to work through. She photographed it and drove to the Granger Mills library and used the research database to look up the specific terminology, and then sat at the library table for a long time with her notebook open and her pen still. The covenant established that the mineral rights beneath the Old Quarry Road property and the 2 acres surrounding it had never been separated from the surface ownership. In most rural land transactions of that era and the decades following, mineral rights had been routinely detached from surface titles and retained or sold independently by larger landholding interests. It was standard practice, so standard that most people who inherited rural properties inherited the surface and nothing below it, without ever knowing there was a distinction to be made. The Whitmore covenant had explicitly and permanently prevented this separation. Whoever owned the surface of the Old Quarry Road property owned everything beneath it, to whatever depth the law recognized, in perpetuity and without exception. She read it one more time. Then she drove back to the farmhouse and stood on the stone-flagged floor of the main room and looked down at her feet. Stone flags over compacted earth, over 2 acres of land, whose mineral rights had been attached without interruption to a building assessed at $3 because its windows were broken and its walls were crumbling, and nobody had looked past the surface to understand what the surface was connected to. She called Dorothy Haynes. She read the covenant document aloud over the phone. She asked Dorothy to confirm her understanding of its legal implications. Dorothy was silent for long enough that Barbara checked the call was still active. Then Dorothy said she would need to review the original document before confirming anything formally. She said that Barbara's reading was, on its face, consistent with what the covenant language appeared to say. She said that if that reading was correct, the implications for the property's actual assessed value were substantially different from $3. She said substantially was perhaps not a strong enough word. She said she would come to the farmhouse in the morning. Barbara thanked her and ended the call. She stood in the kitchen in the building that had been assessed at $3 and looked through the pass-through opening at the wall covered in Cecily's archive. 51 years of quiet, deliberate accumulation, layers of paper and history, and carefully preserved legal fact that a tall woman with straight posture had spent decades assembling in a room that the outside world had written off as worthless. Cecily had known. She had known what the covenant meant and what the land held, and she had spent years building the proof of it, and she had left the proof here on the walls of a room in a building that looked from the outside like something past saving. and she had left the building to the one person she had apparently decided would come and read the walls carefully enough and sit with what they said long enough to understand it. Barbara thought about a funeral 12 years ago. A tall woman with straight posture, speaking with a directness so unperformed that it had stayed in her memory without her knowing why. She thought about 11 days in a car park, $63, a camping stove in a plastic box in the trunk. She thought about a letter she had found only because she had stopped to use a restroom and had asked, on an impulse she still could not explain, whether anything was being held under her name. Dorothy arrived at 9 the following morning with the full property file and a colleague from her office named Paul, who specialized in land and mineral rights, and who shook Barbara's hand at the farmhouse door with the focused attention of a man who had been briefed in the car on the way over and was already thinking several steps ahead. They spent 3 hours in the main room. Paul examined the covenant document and the surrounding archive with the concentrated care of a professional encountering something that fell outside his ordinary caseload. He asked Barbara questions. He took photographs of specific documents. He made calls from the kitchen that Barbara did not try to follow. And that went on for a combined total of nearly an hour. Dorothy sat with Barbara at the camping stove in the kitchen, while Paul worked and drank the tea Barbara made with the last of the tea bags she had, and said that whatever happened next was going to require patience, and that patience was something she wanted to flag early, because in her experience, the people who navigated situations like this most successfully were the ones who understood from the beginning that the pace was set by legal process rather than urgency. Barbara said she had recently developed a considerable capacity for patience. Dorothy looked at her and said she believed that. Paul came back into the kitchen at the end of the 3rd hour and sat down and set his notes on the table and looked at them for a moment before he spoke. He said the covenant was valid. He had called 2 colleagues and a contact at the county land registry, and the consensus was clear. The 1923 document had been properly executed and properly registered, and had never been successfully challenged or superseded in the century since. The mineral rights beneath the Old Quarry Road property were attached to the surface title without interruption and were currently held through the chain of inheritance that ran from the Whitmore family through Cecily Marsh to Barbara Linde by Barbara. He then said that the reason this mattered, in a way that went beyond historical legal curiosity, was something he had confirmed during his calls that morning. The valley in which Old Quarry Road sat had been the subject of preliminary geological survey interest for the past 18 months. A mining geology firm, based 300 miles away, had been conducting regional assessments in the area as part of a broader search for rare earth mineral deposits, driven by the same global supply pressures that had been reshaping the extraction industry for the past decade. They had identified the valley as a priority area for more detailed assessment and had been in the process of researching land ownership before beginning formal approach conversations with relevant property holders. They had not yet identified the Old Quarry Road property as a viable target because the $3 assessment and the probate status had made it appear to be a complication rather than an opportunity. The covenant, which would have changed that calculation entirely, was not visible in the standard title search because it had been registered under the Whitmore name rather than under any subsequent owner, a clerical situation that had kept it functionally invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it in the original documentation. Cecily had known it was there. She had found it, Barbara now understood, through the same methodical archival research that covered the walls of the main room. Decades of patient work tracing the original Whitmore records back to the documents that most people had stopped looking at because the buildings above them had stopped looking worth the effort. Paul said that he would like, with Barbara's permission, to make a preliminary contact with the geological firm to establish whether the interest he had been told about was current and what form a formal conversation might take. He said this was a preliminary step and carried no commitment on Barbara's part, and that she should take whatever time she needed before deciding anything. Barbara looked at the walls of the main room through the pass-through opening. Cecily's archive in the low winter light, layered and patient and exactly where it had always been. She thought about 51 years of a woman living in a building everyone else had dismissed, reading documents that everyone else had stopped looking for, assembling a case that nobody else had thought to make, and leaving it on the walls of a room for the right person to find. She thought about what it meant to be the right person, not the most qualified person, or the most prepared person, or the person with the most resources, or the best connections, or the clearest path forward. Simply the person who had come and read the walls and sat with what they said and not looked away. She told Paul he could make the contact. Then she asked Dorothy if she knew where the nearest hardware store was, because the boarded window on the ground floor needed glass, and the kitchen pipework needed a specific fitting she had identified during her second day of assessment, and she intended to start on both this afternoon because the building had been waiting long enough, and she was not the kind of person who sat still when there was work to be done. Dorothy said the hardware store was on the far end of the main street and was open until 5. Barbara thanked her, wrote hardware store at the top of a new page in her notebook, and below it began the list of everything the farmhouse needed, in the order that made most sense, beginning from the beginning, the way she had always approached things that mattered. Outside, the oak trees stood along Old Quarry Road in the thin November light, large and unbothered, the way things that have been standing for a long time tend to stand. The farmhouse settled around Barbara with the small sounds of a stone building in cold weather. The same sounds it had been making for 137 years to one set of ears after another. She wrote for a long time. The cast iron pan was still in the plastic box in the trunk of the Honda Civic. She would bring it inside today and put it on the old range and cook a proper meal in a kitchen that was hers, on land whose mineral rights were hers, above whatever the earth beneath Old Quarry Road had been holding quietly and without complaint since long before anyone currently living had thought to ask what was there. Frank had managed the money. She had trusted him to manage the money. She was done trusting other people to manage what was hers. She closed the notebook, put the pen in her pocket, and went